Inflation rates may be slowly trickling down, but the damage the high cost of living has inflicted on Canadians' savings and debt levels should alarm anyone. The latest report by Equifax Canada shows that in the last quarter of 2022, total consumer debt rose to $2.4 trillion, up 6.2% from the same period in 2021. And while debt is impacting all consumers across the board, millennials, those aged 27 to 42, are especially feeling the pinch. Joining me now to discuss the report is Rebecca Oakes. She's AVP of Data and Analytics at Equifax. Hi, Rebecca. Great to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
So I read the trends in the report, so thank you for that. I'm personally, Rebecca, concerned. I think leaders should be concerned because I try to impress to people that we can't have economic prosperity when a large portion of our citizens are not prosperous and drowning in debt. Your view, the trends that you're seeing, how problematic is this?
Yeah, I mean, what we are starting to see is that consumers are certainly using credit a lot more than they have been doing the last 2-3 years. Now, during the COVID months, we saw people using it less and less because there was less activity. People weren't going on vacation. They weren't, going to restaurants and things. So that naturally brought some of those debt levels down, which was fantastic. Actually, Canadians were really good in that period and very prudent. But we're starting to see that creep up further and further, particularly on things like credit cards. And I think that really is a bit of a concern because it's kind of in certain groups as well where we're seeing those rises really come through. So it's a little bit concerned in terms of, is inflation having more impact on those individuals?
Yeah, and let's talk about mortgage debt, right? Because people are feeling the pinch because of higher interest rates. I noticed that this is making up a large portion of the overall consumer debt, around 75%. What are you seeing in terms of consumer behaviors?
I mean, when we look at the mortgage population, the good news is when you look purely at missed payments on mortgages, they're still much lower than pre-pandemic, which is the good news. They're starting to creep up a little bit. The less good news is that, as you mentioned, those high interest rates, they are starting to impact pockets of consumers with a mortgage. So particularly those that maybe have a variable rate mortgage where the payment isn't fixed. We've seen where those payments have gone up. There is certainly a much higher increase in terms of missed payments. So that's really having an impact. The piece we're really concerned about for this year is really what happens to renewals on mortgages. There's quite a significant population where they're likely to need to come up and refinance in some way or renew their mortgage. And actually those rates are going to be much higher potentially than when they opened those mortgages originally. So that payment shock that might come through, that might be a bit of a concern.
Yeah, and I think also what's interesting is, people will do whatever it takes to have a roof over their head, right? That's not a payment that most want to miss. What I'm wondering is if they're subsidizing that by way of using the credit cards or perhaps HELOCs.
Yeah, definitely. When we look at where that balanced growth has happened in the last 12 months, almost half of that growth is credit cards and around a quarter is those HELOCs, those home equity lines of credit. So absolutely, consumers are potentially, because their mortgage is maybe creeping up, their payments are going up, they are needing to rely on alternative forms to maybe buy things like groceries, even in some cases, because things, the cost of living has gone up. And that is going to continue to be a challenge. The good news, as you mentioned, inflation's starting to fall down a little bit, but that's really driven by gasoline prices and things, which is a welcome relief. But, I think there's still some way to go yet because, yes, year on year, it's coming down. But last year it was, a big jump. So it's still quite significant compared to kind of 2-3 years ago in terms of things like food prices.
Yeah, and 4%, I mean, it's a bit of a relief, but we still have a ways to go, don't we? Rebecca, you flagged in the report that a lot of the non-mortgage debt was particularly visible with millennials. And I thought this was interesting. Why them? What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, when you reach that kind of age range, as millennial population now is, that does tend to be the most credit active period of your life. Those consumers are things like buying cars. They are trying to get on the property ladder and buying their first home. So we do generally see that when you reach that kind of age range, you are going to be more credit active. But when we do look at it compared to previous years in terms of, that age group, they're certainly increasing at a faster rate than we normally would expect.
All right, we're going to take a commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. My guest is Rebecca Oakes of Equifax Canada. Before the break, we were talking about millennials. Can you share with us what's happening with newcomers, immigrants that are coming into the country, and even refugees, and the debt situation with them?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Canadian government, they have quite hefty targets in terms of welcoming new people into the country. What we saw last year is we had the normal immigration numbers that they were trying to reach, and they managed to achieve that. We also had increased population from things like what's happening in Ukraine. There was a lot of refugees and kind of people coming into Canada just looking for a place to kind of live that was a little bit safer. So we're seeing big increases in terms of the population. So I think the increase was around 1 million last year in total. And that obviously starts to feed into a few things. It feeds into the financial needs of those individuals. They also need access to things like credit, and that can be a challenge because when you first arrive in the country, it's difficult because you don't have a credit file and things like that. And they also need things like housing. So, there's lots of needs those individuals have.
Yeah. Switch gears, Rebecca, the amount of delinquencies that we're seeing, because I'm noticing that's also up.
Yes, absolutely. And we're seeing it really, well, at the end of Q4, we were seeing it primarily for consumers that don't have a mortgage. So what that tells us is that population, they tend to be a little bit younger, they tend to be a little bit lower income. And actually that was likely the impact of those higher cost of livings of inflation. And so we're seeing things like credit cards and auto loans in particular. That's where we're seeing increases in missed payments. Now, as we look into the first quarter of this year, we're starting to see a bit of a shift. We're starting to see a little bit more growth now in consumers with a mortgage. And again, back to kind of what I was saying earlier around interest rates and renewing, we think that's probably linked to that, the impact of that. So those consumers are coming to renew their mortgages, their payments are higher, and that's having a knock-on impact in terms of missing payments on things like credit cards.
And can you just qualify, is it the percentage of delinquencies that is going up? I have to assume that it's also the amount that they're filing for.
Yes,
Okay.
it is. So we look at two things. We look at the kind of the number of people who are missing payments, and we also look at the balances. Now, balances actually on average are a little bit lower in terms of things like credit card average balance, but that's really just because of what happened during COVID and that reduction, and that is creeping back up again. So we're kind of almost back to pre-COVID levels on most products now, but it is both elements that we look at.
Okay. So there's delinquencies, right? Missed payments, consumer proposals. So this is sort of that next step of insolvency. And I noticed that it was up more than 26%.
Yeah, it's a big increase. So when we look at insolvencies, as you mentioned, there's two parts. There's consumer proposals and there's a full bankruptcy. Now, the good news is that when we look at bankruptcy numbers, they've been pretty flat since the start of COVID. So there was a big drop when we had all those support mechanisms that came in place when the pandemic first hit. And bankruptcy levels have remained fairly static. So they're down compared to 2019. Consumer proposals are really on the rise, though. We're seeing those levels exceed where we were pre-pandemic. And the difference with proposals is it's really an agreement to pay back a certain amount of your debt, but it protects assets like a house and things like your vehicle, your car. So these types of insolvencies tend to be very popular with homeowners. And again, it kind of links a little bit to what we're seeing with where some of that impact's coming through from interest rates. If you own your own home and you're struggling to make those payments, this is a potential route to deal with your other debt situation. Now, obviously, it has a big impact on things like your credit score because it's a very negative thing to happen. But I think that's why we're seeing that big rise, is that it does help those consumers with assets to have a way to deal with their finances.
Rebecca, we only have 40 seconds till the end of this interview, but For those who are watching and are seeing their credit debt rise, what's your advice?
Budgeting, always budget. Look at what's going to happen in the future. If you have a mortgage coming up for renewal, start planning now in terms of what that might do to your payments, and maybe you can adjust spending. And there are lots of great organizations out there who can help with budgeting and giving you advice.
And look at their credit reports. I mean, is that helpful, do you find?
Absolutely.
I
It's
know you
always
work at
good to make sure.
Equifax, but but
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's always good to make sure everything's in check and that there isn't anything on there unexpected. It's good for kind of fraud protection. So yeah, absolutely. It's free to kind of go online, look at your credit report. So definitely do that.
okay, Rebecca, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate your time.